In this, our final topic together, we wrap up the course. We've covered so much, and we're also going to look ahead at the future of businesses' human rights responsibilities and impacts, and ask the question, what's next? How will we strengthen business respect for human rights? What should the priorities be going forward, and how should we pursue them? Fact is, these are all open questions, and I'm really keen to hear your thoughts and ideas. The future is unwritten, and you, yes you, as future leaders of business, future lawyers, future professionals, have an opportunity to be a part of writing and shaping that future. What an exciting prospect. Indeed, I'd encourage you to reflect on the course and the terrain we've covered. What speaks to you in a deep way? Was there a topic, perhaps it was conflict zones or supply chains, pursuing human rights accountability through the courts, or the power of boycotts, institutions, or the history of business and human rights? Whatever the element of the course and of businesses' human rights obligations, ask what resonates with you. What will you take from the course? Now that looking back over the course is useful in its own right to reinforce what we've learnt. It's also going to be helpful when developing your final assessment piece too, but hopefully that reflection will also remain with you. Some lessons or ideas that you can take from the course and take with you into your studies and into your career that lies ahead. The movement to achieve greater corporate respect for human rights dates back centuries. It has come into its own and is now very much the domain of law and global governance in the past few decades, chiefly via the United Nations. The human rights responsibilities of business, big and small, are now part of the discourse in Canberra, in New York and Geneva. It is a subject of domestic legislation and international law. Accountability and justice for victims of corporate human rights abuses is nowadays pursued in the courts in Europe and the United States, and by other non-judicial means too, the world over. How do we achieve greater corporate respect for human rights? Do we encourage or do we compel? Do we mandate and legislate, or do we voluntarily commit? We observed that the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights do not mandate corporate compliance with human rights. Remember the Protect, Respect, Remedy framework on which the UN GPs are based? States must protect, companies should respect, and victims of corporate human rights abuses should have access to remedy. Are we okay with that language? That terminology, that level of human rights legal obligation? Or is it time for some harder legal regulation of companies' human rights obligations at the global level, at the United Nations? We've seen over the course that some countries have implemented tougher human rights obligations on companies, in particular around modern slavery concerns and supply chain labour abuses. So, is the next iteration of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights going to be similarly tougher and harder? These are open questions, and I look forward to debating them with you. And to be sure, these are precisely the same debates being had in the halls of Geneva and New York right now. In fact, in 2014, 2 dueling resolutions were put to the United Nations Human Rights Council on this topic of the future of business and human rights and the law. One said that the path forward on businesses' respect for human rights is to continue down the path of the UN Guiding Principles, encouraging companies to do better. The other resolution, put to the UN Human Rights Council, said that the UN GPs were insufficient, and instead a treaty with binding, legally enforceable human rights obligations for businesses must be developed. which passed? Well, rather curiously, both did. So right now, the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights remains the cornerstone of the global conversation around business and human rights, even at the same time as a treaty is being drafted on businesses' human rights obligations. Where do you stand on this debate? What's the best approach? What should such a business and human rights treaty say? What human rights should companies be obliged to respect? For my part, I think the next step, this treaty, should be narrowly drafted, narrowly construed, just focused on ending egregious corporate human rights abuses, not protecting every human right. Now that may sound controversial, hypocritical, and I welcome some pushback, but I see the previous attempts at a wide-ranging business and human rights treaty and their failures as a cautionary tale. They've all failed in the past. Why? Well, perhaps they failed because they were too ambitious in scope. I advocate for an incremental approach to a business and human rights treaty. Let's start modestly, gain the support needed from governments and businesses around the world, and build from there. The first business and human rights treaty need not be the last one. Others, of course, take a different view. One of my dear colleagues, a prominent professor of business and human rights, suggests that we should draft the treaty with maximalist ambition, maximalist goals. All companies must protect all human rights all the time. He says that even knowing that it won't garner the support a treaty needs to pass into law. In fact, this is why he says it. He's skeptical any treaty will pass into law, and so he thinks at the very least we shouldn't compromise in the drafting of it. All treaty attempts will fail, so why not stake our flag? Where do you stand on the issue? What do you think is the best way to go in drafting a business and human rights treaty? More broadly, as we end the course, what's the next step for the law, domestically and internationally, in advancing the cause of businesses' respect for human rights? We have covered an enormous amount during this course. I hope you've learned a bit and enjoyed the journey as well. I look forward to watching in the years to come what you, as future leaders of the legal and business worlds, will do with this knowledge on business and human rights. I encourage you to find ways to apply this knowledge, and please feel free to reach out to me if I can be of any assistance. I can't wait. Let me close out with the words of the late great John Ruggie, who perhaps more than any other single person has done the most to advance businesses' respect for human rights. He observed, "Our fragile world is in desperate need of systemic change. Unconnected fragments here and there will not achieve the outcomes we need. We are surrounded by opportunities to drive human rights considerations into everyday decisions by business and governments. Let's seize them."